Abandoned golden retriever and her puppies were freezing. Then a miracle happened. The cold was relentless, an unyielding force that seeped into the bones and refused to let go. Ethan Mercer tightened his coat around himself as he walked through the dimly lit streets of the small town, his breath curling in the air like ghostly wisps. The snow had started falling hours ago, blanketing everything in an eerie silence. It was a silence Ethan knew well, one that wasn't just from the weather, but from within himself. Words didn't come easily to him anymore. Once articulate, once a man who could command a room with ease, he was now a prisoner to his own mind, his speech fractured and hesitant, thanks to the aphasia that had taken root after the accident. But tonight, none of that mattered. His boots crunched against the icy pavement as he passed the old warehouse near the edge of town. The place long abandoned, its windows shattered and roof sagging from years of neglect. Ethan had no reason to stop, no reason to glance inside. But he did. A sound, faint but distinct, pierced the quiet. A whimper, soft and desperate, almost lost in the howling wind. He hesitated, his heart quickening, then stepped toward the entrance. The rusted door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing darkness that smelled of decay and dampness. The weak glow from the street lamp outside cast long shadows inside, and that was when he saw them. A golden retriever, ribs pressing against her frail body, curled protectively around a cluster of tiny, shivering puppies. Her amber eyes locked onto his, filled with both fear and hope, as if she were uncertain whether he was salvation or another cruel twist of fate. Ethan swallowed hard. He took a cautious step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey," he murmured, his voice hoarse, the words difficult to form. You okay?" Of course, the question was absurd. The dog was not okay. She was starving, weak, and her puppies barely moved, their tiny bodies huddled together for warmth. Ethan knelt, feeling the bitter cold seep through his jeans, but he ignored it. He extended a hand, palm open, showing he meant no harm. The mother flinched but didn't snarl. That was a good sign. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the remnants of a granola bar he had meant to eat earlier. He broke it into smaller pieces and placed them near her. She sniffed hesitantly before devouring the crumbs, her hunger overcoming her wariness. Ethan took a shaky breath. He wasn't sure what to do next. He could barely care for himself, let alone a dog and her puppies. But he couldn't walk away, not from them. Reaching into his other pocket, he fumbled with his phone, his fingers stiff from the cold. He typed out a message, struggling with the letters, the effort mentally exhausting. Dog, warehouse, cold. Help? He sent it to the only person he could think of, Nora, his neighbor, the only one who still spoke to him as if he were whole. Minutes passed, each one stretching unbearably. He stayed where he was, trying to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. The mother, Hope, he decided to call her, rested her head on her paws, her body trembling from exhaustion. One of the puppies let out a weak, pitiful cry, and Ethan's chest tightened. The sound of tires crunching against ice outside pulled him from his thoughts. A beam of light sliced through the warehouse as a car pulled up. Moments later, hurried footsteps echoed inside. "Ethan!" Nora's voice rang out, breathless with concern. Then she saw what he had found. "Oh, God!" She crouched beside him, her blonde hair escaping from beneath her knit cap. She didn't ask why he had called her, didn't ask why he had been here in the first place. She just assessed the situation, her mind already working faster than Ethan's ever could these days. "We need to get them out of here," she said, pulling off her scarf and gently wrapping it around the shivering puppies. "They won't survive the night in this cold." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard as he fought to form words. She sick?" He motioned toward Hope. Nora's expression softened. "Maybe. Malnourished for sure." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "Ethan, are you sure you want to do this?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Together they worked quickly. Hope was weak but didn't resist when Ethan carefully lifted her into his arms. Her body was light, too light. Nora carried the puppies in the folds of her thick coat, cradling them close to her chest as they hurried to her car. The drive back to Ethan's house was tense, the heater blasting in an attempt to warm the frozen animals. Hope lay curled in the back seat, her eyes barely open, while the puppies nestled against Nora. Ethan didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Nora filled the silence with quiet reassurances, telling him what they would do next. We'll need to feed them something gentle, warm broth, maybe. I have some blankets at home, and a veterinarian. We should call a vet first thing in the morning. Ethan clenched his jaw, frustrated at how difficult it was to find the words he wanted. He wanted to tell her he was grateful, that he wasn't sure what he would have done if she hadn't come. But all he managed was a gruff, "Thanks." She gave him a small smile. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Ethan wanted to believe her. When they arrived at his house, the real challenge began. Hope was too weak to move on her own, so Ethan carried her inside, laying her carefully near the fireplace. Nora set the puppies beside her, and for the first time that night, they stopped shivering. Hope lifted her head slightly, giving Ethan a look that made something deep inside him ache. "You're safe now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Nora busied herself preparing some warm milk and soft food, while Ethan sat beside Hope, watching her, feeling something stir within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in white, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, this silent plea he had answered was the beginning of something he hadn't even known he needed. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows, casting a pale glow over the small living room. Ethan sat on the floor beside the fireplace, his fingers absently stroking Hope's thin fur. She was asleep, her body rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths, her golden coat still dull from malnutrition. The puppies, nestled against her, let out tiny whimpers as they twitched in their sleep, their small paws paddling the air as if running through dreams. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath still unsteady from exhaustion. His body ached from the cold night, from the tension of worry, from the overwhelming reality of what he had taken on. He had barely slept, unwilling to leave Hope's side, afraid that if he closed his eyes, she might not be breathing when he woke. A soft knock at the door startled him. He rubbed his tired eyes before pushing himself up to his feet, his movements stiff and sluggish. When he opened the door, Nora stood there, bundled in a thick sweater, balancing a plastic container in one hand and a bag of supplies in the other. She gave him a look, one that was equal parts exhaustion and amusement. "Did you sleep at all?" Ethan shrugged, stepping aside to let her in. Words weren't easy in the mornings, but Nora had long since learned to read past his silence. She set the container on the small kitchen counter before peeling off her gloves. "I brought some homemade broth. It's gentle, and it'll help build up her strength." She nodded toward Hope, who still hadn't stirred. "How's she doing?" Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, searching for the words, but all he could manage was a simple, "Better, I think." Nora studied him, her sharp eyes catching the hesitation in his voice. She didn't press, simply moving to the fireplace, crouching beside Hope, and placing a gentle hand on her side. "She's warmer now," she murmured, as if speaking more to the dog than to Ethan. "That's good." Ethan watched as she worked, pouring the broth into a shallow dish, breaking apart soft bread into tiny pieces that could be soaked and swallowed easily. He hated how much he relied on her for this, hated that he struggled to say the things he wanted to say. That before the accident, before the damage that scrambled his words, he would have been the one taking charge. But he wasn't that man anymore. He clenched his fists, frustration curling in his gut. I can do it." The words felt thick on his tongue, clumsy and uncooperative. He reached for the dish, but Nora didn't move away. She only nodded and handed him the spoon. "Okay." She didn't pity him, didn't correct him, didn't rush to take over when the spoon trembled slightly in his grip. Instead, she simply watched as he knelt beside Hope and carefully, slowly, brought the broth to her lips. At first, the dog didn't move. Panic shot through Ethan's chest, but before he could react, her nose twitched and she lazily licked at the warm liquid. Relief flooded through him. He repeated the motion, coaxing her to drink little by little, and after a few minutes, Hope lifted her head just enough to take a few stronger sips. Ethan let out a shaky breath, barely noticing when Nora placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're doing great," she murmured, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. His throat tightened, and he only nodded, unable to force out a reply. The hours passed in a quiet rhythm. Nora stayed, tending to the puppies, helping Ethan prepare a small corner of the living room with soft towels and a makeshift bed, so that Hope and her litter could rest in comfort. The room smelled of wood smoke and the faint, savory scent of broth, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness pressing against his chest. As evening settled in, a knock at the door broke the fragile peace. Ethan tensed, glancing at Nora before hesitantly moving to answer it. When he pulled the door open, he was met with the sight of a middle-aged woman bundled in a thick coat, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. She held a small basket in one hand, her expression kind but uncertain. "Hi there," she said, offering a tentative smile. I, I heard from Nora about the dogs. I run the animal shelter a few blocks over, and I just wanted to stop by, see if you needed anything." Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind scrambling for words, but his tongue refused to cooperate. He knew what he wanted to say. "Thank you, come in. Yes, we need help." But all he could manage was a brief nod. The woman didn't seem put off by his silence. She stepped inside at Nora's invitation, setting the basket on the table. "I brought some formula for the puppies, in case the mother's milk isn't enough, and some extra blankets." She glanced at Ethan, her gaze gentle but assessing. "You've taken on quite a responsibility." Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to speak. "They needed help." It wasn't much, but the woman smiled. "Yes, and you answered." The conversation moved on, with Nora filling in the gaps Ethan couldn't. They discussed Hope's condition, the puppy's care, the long road ahead. Ethan listened, absorbing everything, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely settled by the knowledge that they weren't alone in this. When the woman finally left, Nora turned to him, arms crossed. "You okay?" He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Tired," she chuckled. "Yeah, I figured." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "You know, this doesn't have to be just a temporary thing." Ethan frowned, confused. "What?" She gestured toward Hope and her puppies. "This, taking care of them, helping animals. I don't know, Ethan. I see the way you are with them. You're patient. You understand them in a way most people don't. Maybe this is something you're meant to do." His chest tightened. He shook his head, frustrated at how the words failed him. Meant to do? He had spent so long feeling broken, lost, incapable of holding on to the life he once had. The idea that he could find something new, something meaningful, terrified him. He glanced at Hope, now watching him with tired but trusting eyes, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, but as he sat back down beside her, gently stroking her fur, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her down. The first real snowfall of the season arrived that night, blanketing the town in a soft hush that made everything feel new and untouched. Ethan sat by the window, watching the flakes swirl outside, their slow descent mesmerizing in the dim glow of the street lamp. Behind him, the fire crackled, filling the room with warmth that contrasted against the cold, pressing against the glass. Hope was curled up in her nest of blankets, her puppies nestled tightly against her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. The room was quiet except for the occasional pop from the fire and the faint whimper of a dreaming puppy. Ethan shifted in his chair, stretching his stiff fingers before rubbing his hands together. The exhaustion from the past few days weighed heavy on him, but his mind refused to settle. Everything had changed so quickly. One moment, his life had been predictable, monotonous, safe in its isolation. The next, he had a house full of fragile lives depending on him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He hesitated, then stood, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before unlocking it. Nora stood on the other side, bundled in her thick coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes clinging to the strands of her hair. She held a plastic container in her hands and lifted it slightly as she stepped inside. "I figured you haven't eaten," she said, not waiting for an answer before heading toward the kitchen. Ethan followed, shoving his hands into his pockets, watching as she set the container on the counter and peeled off her gloves. She moved around the kitchen like she belonged there, grabbing plates, heating up the soup she had brought. It was effortless, her presence slipping into the quiet of his home without disrupting it. He wanted to tell her he appreciated it, that he wasn't used to this kind of company anymore. But the words tangled in his throat, so he simply nodded when she handed him a bowl and sat across from him at the table. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of spoons against ceramic. After a few minutes, Nora leaned back in her chair, studying him with a look he was starting to recognize. One that meant she was thinking about something, deciding whether or not to say it. He braced himself. "I talked to the vet today," she said, setting her spoon down. Ethan tensed, his grip tightening around his bowl. Hope's blood work came back. She's got a few deficiencies, but nothing that can't be fixed with proper care. The real issue is the infection in her leg. It's not bad yet, but it could get worse if we don't stay on top of it. He exhaled slowly, relieved and anxious all at once. He had spent the last 2 days watching her, waiting for something to go wrong, afraid that despite his efforts, he might lose her anyway. "Meds?" he asked. The word coming out clipped, but Nora understood. She nodded. "Antibiotics, pain management. I already picked them up. You'll just have to make sure she takes them." She hesitated, then added, "She's going to be okay, Ethan." "You're doing a good job." He swallowed, staring down at the soup, his appetite suddenly gone. He wasn't sure why it was so hard to hear that, why it made his chest feel tight and uncomfortable, but he nodded anyway. They finished eating in silence, and after washing the dishes, Nora moved to the living room, kneeling beside Hope. The dog blinked up at her sleepily, her tail thumping weakly against the floor. "She trusts you," Nora said, scratching behind Hope's ear. "Dogs are good at that, knowing who's safe." Ethan watched as Hope leaned into her touch, her body relaxing. He felt something stir inside him, something warm and unfamiliar. He didn't know if he deserved the trust Hope had given him, but he wasn't going to betray it. "I can stay for a bit," Nora said after a moment, glancing at him. "If you want." He hesitated, not because he didn't want her there, but because the offer felt like something bigger than it was. He wasn't used to people offering to stay, to help, to be there without expecting anything in return. After a long pause, he nodded. "Okay." They sat in the living room, the fire crackling, the snow continuing to fall outside. Nora talked about small things, stories about the town, people he only knew in passing, memories of the winters she had spent here growing up. Ethan listened, letting the sound of her voice fill the spaces where his own words wouldn't come. At some point, his head grew heavy, his body finally giving in to exhaustion, and he let his eyes close, the warmth of the fire lulling him into sleep. He didn't hear Nora get up, didn't notice when she covered him with a blanket before slipping out into the quiet of the night, leaving behind the unspoken promise that she would be back. Ethan woke to the soft sound of paws patting against the wooden floor, the scent of lingering ash from the fireplace mixing with the cold morning air that seeped through the cracks of his old house. His neck ached from falling asleep in the chair, and as he shifted, the blanket that had been draped over him slid onto the floor. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before remembering the quiet presence that had kept him company last night. Nora. She had stayed, at least for a little while. He wasn't sure what to make of that. Hope was awake, her amber eyes watching him from her makeshift bed, her puppy still curled tightly against her stomach. She looked better today, her breathing steadier, her body less tense. The antibiotics must have started working. Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face before pushing himself up. His body protested, stiff from the awkward sleep, but he ignored it, making his way toward the kitchen. His movements were slow, methodical, as he went through the motions of making coffee, though his mind was already preoccupied with the day ahead. The vet had given them a plan, feeding schedules, medications, checkups. He needed to stick to it. No room for mistakes. He poured the coffee into a mug, gripping it tightly with both hands as he leaned against the counter, staring at the frost creeping along the edges of the window. The thought settled in his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. He had a purpose now. The knock at the door startled him, breaking him from his thoughts. He hesitated for a brief second before setting down his mug and heading toward it. When he opened the door, Nora stood there, the morning light casting a golden hue over her as she shoved her gloved hands into her coat pockets. "Morning," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You look terrible." Ethan huffed a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't sleep well," he admitted, his words slow but steady. She stepped past him without waiting for an invitation, which he was beginning to realize was just the way she operated. He didn't mind. He shut the door behind her as she set a brown paper bag on the counter and started unpacking its contents. "Got some things for you," she said, pulling out a few cans of dog food, a fresh loaf of bread, and a container of soup. "Figured you wouldn't think to go shopping for yourself." Ethan watched her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Didn't have time," he muttered, knowing she wasn't wrong. She handed him a small bottle of vitamins. "For you, don't argue." He took it without a word, knowing better than to fight her on it. She turned her attention to Hope, kneeling beside her with practiced ease. "How's she doing?" Ethan exhaled, crouching down as well. "Better." He gestured toward the puppies. "Stronger." Nora smiled, brushing her fingers lightly over one of the tiny golden bodies. "Good," she murmured. "They've got a fighting chance then." Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of that truth settle in his chest. He hadn't let himself think about the possibility of losing them, but it had been there, lurking in the back of his mind. Now, for the first time, he let himself believe that they might make it, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going to fail them. "You're doing a good thing, Ethan," Nora said softly, her eyes meeting his. He looked away, uncomfortable with the praise, but she didn't push. Instead, she stood, brushing off her jeans. "Come on, let's get you something to eat before you collapse." The day passed in a quiet rhythm. They worked together, feeding the dogs, tending to the house, falling into a routine that neither of them spoke about but both accepted. It felt natural in a way Ethan couldn't explain. When evening arrived, Nora lingered by the door, hesitating for the first time. "I should go," she said, but there was something uncertain in her voice. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks," he said, and this time the word didn't feel forced. She smiled, and then, just like that, she was gone. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching as she disappeared into the night, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone.